All right, welcome back. Thanks for coming back for part two. So just to refresh your memory on where we left off, there's a lot of variation in social mobility across areas. We think a lot of that is due to the causal effects of neighborhoods. And what I want to talk about in this lecture is what that means for policy and what we can potentially do to improve social mobility and so on. So I'm going to focus on two policy questions in this lecture, two types of policy questions. The first is the obvious one that you'd think of, which is how can we improve social mobility in areas with low rates of mobility, the dark red areas in the maps we were looking at in the last lecture. And so I'm going to start from the 5 correlations that we ended with in the last lecture: segregation, school quality, income inequality, and so forth. And motivated by those correlations in the data, I'm going to look for specific policies that might manipulate these factors and end up having effects on social mobility. And I'm going to concentrate in particular in this lecture on the first two of these, segregation and school quality. And the reason I do that, let me explain a little bit of the rationale. Some of it is just the path dependence of the nature of the research, but I think there's also there are intellectual reasons to pursue the first two, at least to start. And this is because they are manipulable in ways through policy that the other factors are much harder to change. So in particular, if you take factors 4 and 5, family structure and social capital, while it's quite plausible that they might have very important causal effects on social mobility, it's much harder to know what we should do in terms of policy in order to change the number of married individuals, so the family structure measures we were thinking about in the last lecture, or how do you change the amount of social capital in an area. I think it's very interesting to think about the effects of social capital and how one might go about changing social capital, but at the moment I think there aren't obvious policy tools at our that are immediately available. And so that motivates the focus on things like school quality, where there is a very natural policy debate, a set of interventions one can think about. Income inequality, I think, is a very interesting issue, which of course can be changed through tax policy by having more redistributive taxes. Obviously, you can change the amount of income inequality. Whether that has a causal effect on mobility or not is an interesting open question that we don't know the answer to. I think it'd be very interesting to study in future work. So the first question is what we'd call positive analysis in public economics, just understanding the effects of different types of policies. The second question that I'm going to spend some time on in this lecture is a normative question about optimal policy. That is improving social mobility actually a desirable goal? Kind of taking as a premise that we want to increase social mobility, but is that actually something we should be trying to do? And so in thinking about this, I think one thing that's clear is that policies that improve opportunities for the poor without hurting the rich are clearly desirable. That is, policies that basically generate Pareto improvements, where you increase the incomes of children who started out in disadvantaged families and don't end up affecting others in society adversely under normal social welfare functions that respect the Pareto principle. You would think that that you want to pursue such policies. However, that might not always be the case. In some situations, greater opportunity for the poor might come at the expense of outcomes that children from higher income families have. And in that case, the best policy is going to depend upon your preference for equity, that is the weight you put on issues like social mobility, versus other factors like economic efficiency or meritocracy, other principles that you might care about. And so I'll talk a little bit about those issues and focus in particular on the question of to what extent higher upward mobility seems to come at the expense of more downward mobility. So here's an outline of this lecture. I'm first going to talk about segregation and how we might change segregation through affordable housing policies. Second, I'll spend some time on education policies. And then I'll talk about the normative issues in the context of some work we're doing on opportunity, innovation, and growth. Now, what I'm going to present in this lecture is based primarily on 3 papers. a study of the Moving to Opportunity experiment, which we'll put out in a couple of weeks, a pair of papers that were published in the American Economic Review last year on measuring the impacts of teachers, and another study on the life cycle of inventors, which is work in progress. Okay, so let's start with part one on segregation and affordable housing policies. So there are many potential policies that governments might try to undertake to promote the amount of integration in a society. So for example, you might offer low-income families subsidized housing vouchers to rent better apartments. So this is a policy that's quite important in the US, for instance. Another approach you might take is to build mixed income affordable housing. So try to get developers to build properties that not only have more expensive units in a nice neighborhood, but also have some units that are designed to be for lower income families and might have some rent control or some subsidy associated with them. So given the fact that there's a correlation, a strong negative correlation between segregation and rates of upward mobility, it's natural to wonder whether these types of policies might be effective in increasing rates of social mobility. And not just that, really what you want to ask is whether they're effective in increasing social mobility relative to a very natural alternative, which is just to give families an equivalent amount of cash instead. So you can give people subsidies in the form of housing vouchers. Say you give people $5,000 a year or something like that, but you could also just give them a check for $5,000. And standard economic theory would tell you that typically you'd think just giving people cash is the best solution, because if they're optimizing, they're going to make the best decision they can themselves. They can always go and move to that better neighborhood if they wanted to. And so maybe giving people cash is better than trying to deliberately change where they live. And so I'll touch upon both of these issues. So understanding the effects of these housing policies on mobility, I think, is of particular interest given the amounts that some governments spend on such policies. So in the US, for instance, we spend $50 billion a year on various types of affordable housing initiatives. So we spend about $20 or $25 billion on housing voucher subsidies, which are what I was just describing. If you're a family, a low-income family, you basically can get support from the government to defray part of your rental costs. Other policies include tax credits for real estate developers to build properties that will be affordable by low-income households. Or another major aspect of affordable housing policy in the US, especially historically, is building large public housing projects, which basically are enormous complexes which have low costs where low-income families below a certain income threshold are eligible to live. So what I want to ask here is essentially, are these policies effective, and how can they be better designed if one is keeping this goal of improving social mobility in mind? So I'm going to start by focusing on one of these policies in particular, the housing voucher subsidies, which are the biggest such policies in the US. And I'm going to focus in particular on the Moving to Opportunity experiment, which provides some very nice evidence on the effects of such housing voucher subsidies. So the Moving to Opportunity experiment is one of the most well-known experiments in social science. It was conducted between 1994 and 1998 in the US, and it involved about 5,000 families in 5 large cities in the United States. And the way it worked is that families were randomly assigned to one of 3 groups. There was the experimental group, which received housing vouchers that were restricted to low poverty, that is less than 10% poverty rate census tracts. So you got these roughly $6,000 on average per year housing voucher subsidies, and you could only use them to rent an apartment in areas that had relatively low rates of poverty. Okay, so they came with this important restriction. A second group, called the Section 8 group, received conventional housing vouchers, what's called the Section 8 housing voucher program in the US, hence that name. And the key distinction between that group and the experimental voucher group is that the Section 8 group, their vouchers had no restrictions at all. So one important thing to keep in mind in the context of the results I'm going to show you is that everything that the people in the experimental group could have chosen, the people in the Section 8 group could also have made the same exact choices. They just received more flexible vouchers. And then finally, there was the control group who didn't get either of these vouchers and was just given the option of staying in public housing, which is where all these families started out in these public housing projects, which are in very high poverty areas. More than 50% of the people in these areas are below the poverty line. Okay, so we're going to compare the outcomes across these three groups. And just to give you a concrete sense of what we're talking about in terms of what the Moving to Opportunity experiment did, let me show you one of the sites in New York, what the typical residential locations of the people in the three groups were. So in the experimental group, let me start with the control group. In the control group, the most common location where people lived is, it's called the Martin Luther King Towers, which is a very big housing project shown here in the lower right in Harlem, so just north of Central Park in Manhattan. And so the families in the control group stayed in those housing projects. The families who received the Section 8 vouchers, many of them, the most common place to which they moved was about 5 or 6 miles north in the Bronx to a area called Soundview. And then a very common place that people in the experimental voucher group moved is an additional 5 or 6 miles north in a area called Wakefield in the North Bronx, which is an area with significantly lower rates of poverty. That's a photo of what that area looks like. So you can see very different from the large housing projects, more what a regular neighborhood might look like. So what I want to illustrate here is that these are incredibly short distance moves, right? We're really talking about very narrow differences in terms of geography. So what I want to ask basically are, what are the consequences of living over here in the North Bronx versus living 10 miles away in Harlem? So there's a very large body of research studying the Moving to Opportunity experiment over the past 20 years or so. And somewhat disappointingly for sociology, in particular, where sociologists have thought for a long time that neighborhoods matter, this experiment has found relatively little impact of moving to a better area on economic outcomes such as earnings. So if you compare the earnings of adults living in the North Bronx versus living in Harlem, you don't actually find that much of a difference. Now, critically, that research has focused on adults and older youth at the point of the move. So adults and essentially teenagers who moved to these different areas. But coming back to the issues we were talking about in the last lecture, where we saw these linear exposure effects, that every extra year you spend in the better environment really seems to matter, we decided to revisit the MTO experiment and ask whether you find similar exposure effects in that data. That is, does the Moving to Opportunity intervention improve outcomes for children who moved when they were particularly young, which would be consistent with the predictions we'd get from the quasi-experimental analysis I showed you in the last lecture. And so we wanted to understand how all this fits together. So in order to do that, we took the Moving to Opportunity data on these 5,000 families and linked that to the federal income tax returns, which I was using in the previous lecture, so that we'd be able to track the kids forward and look at their outcomes as adults in their mid to late 20s. So let me show you the results of that analysis. I'm going to show you these results through a series of just simple bar charts which compare average outcomes across these three groups. So the group on the left here, shown in gray, is the control group. They stayed in the high poverty housing projects. The Section 8 group are the people who moved to the middle of the Bronx in the map I was showing you. And these are the set of people who moved to the lower poverty areas like the North Bronx, the experimental voucher. So in what I'm showing you initially, I'm going to concentrate on children who were relatively young at the point of move. In particular, kids who were less than 13 years old at the point that they were randomly assigned to one of these three groups. And the first outcome we're going to look at is the earnings of these kids when they're in their mid to late 20s. And so what you can see is that in the control group, the mean earnings of these kids is $11,270. That compares with about $13,000 in the Section 8 group and $14,700 in the experimental voucher group. And that red bar is statistically significantly different from the mean in the control group with a p-value of about 0.01. So the magnitude of that difference is actually quite substantial when you think about it in percentage terms. These kids who are just living 10 miles away from the comparable set of kids in the control group, they're making about roughly $3,500 more per year. So it's something like a 30% to 35% increase in earnings just as a result of making this move and growing up in a somewhat different environment during their childhood. Okay, so we're seeing significant gains in terms of earnings for kids who moved at young ages. So now let's look at a few other outcomes. The right panel here shows you impacts on college attendance. College attendance rates in this population are very low on average, right? This is an incredibly disadvantaged population where mean incomes of the parents are below $10,000. Large fraction of parents are not working. Virtually all the kids are being raised in single-parent families and so on. And so in the control group, the mean college attendance rate is only 16.5%. That compares with 18% in the Section 8 group, 21.7% in the experimental voucher group. So you're getting about a 5 percentage point impact in terms of increases in college attendance rates. Again, relative to this really low starting base of only 16%, that's roughly a 1/3 increase in the probability that you go to college as a result of these housing voucher subsidies. Couple other outcomes. So these children, when they're adults, they themselves are living in areas with lower rates of poverty. That is, they themselves are living as adults in better neighborhoods if they are in the experimental voucher group as opposed to the control group. And that's quite intuitive. If you're earning more money, presumably you're going to be able to afford an apartment in a better area. And so you see that these children are in fact living in better neighborhoods as adults. And that's important because it suggests that that initial housing voucher subsidy not only has an effect on the current set of children, but on their subsequent children, so on the grandchildren of the original MTO participants, because there are persistent improvements in neighborhood effects in the quality of neighborhoods for the subsequent generations. And then finally, one last outcome, a little bit outside the traditional economic focus. Here we're looking at the fraction of women who become single mothers. And in the control group, that's 33%, compares with 31% in the Section 8 group, and 23%, so a 10 percentage point decline in the probability that you have a child and raise that child as a single parent if you receive this housing voucher subsidy and move to a lower poverty area. So along various dimensions, you do in fact see that the Moving to Opportunity experiment and these housing voucher subsidies in particular have really substantial impacts on younger kids' long-term success. Now let's compare that with the effects on the older kids, ages 13 to 18 at random assignment. And here you see that the impacts look very different. So I'm picking a couple of the outcomes here, earnings and the fraction who become single mothers. If anything, it looks like the earnings in the control group are somewhat higher than in the experimental and Section 8 voucher group. So that is, the kids who moved to these better neighborhoods at older ages, they don't look like they're doing any better. If anything, it looks like they're doing slightly worse than the children who stayed back in Harlem in the high poverty housing projects. Similarly, if you look at the single parenthood outcome, they're actually just about as likely to become single parents, if anything, slightly more likely to become single parents if they're in the experimental voucher group. And so the reason you might see some negative effects potentially of moving these kids at older ages is that there could be sort of a disruption effect where there's a fixed cost of moving children to a different environment where you have to adapt to a new environment, a new set of friends, and so on. And that might actually end up being detrimental in terms of long-term outcomes. Now, why do you end up seeing positive effects for the younger kids? If there are positive gains in proportion to your time of exposure, then one simple model to describe the data is that there's a fixed cost of moving, that's a disruption effect, but then over time, as you're exposed for more and more years, you eventually overcome that disruption effect and get a positive return if you move at a young enough age. That type of model looks consistent with the data that we're seeing here. But in any case, the pattern that's clear is that you see significant gains for the younger children and little or no gain for the older children in this intervention. Now, consistent with what had been shown in prior research, you also see that for adults, there's essentially no impact of moving to one of these lower poverty, more integrated communities. The mean earnings for the adults essentially don't change depending upon where they live. So that's consistent with the view that it's really childhood exposure that's playing a key role in terms of the long-term impacts of these vouchers. Okay, so what can we extract in terms of policy lessons from that analysis? So as I've emphasized, there are substantial gains for children who move at young ages. So we were looking at kids who were below 13. For simplicity, those kids are age 8 on average when they move. Substantial gains for those kids from moving to lower poverty neighborhoods. As I said, there's about a 30% gain in earnings, which translates to an increase in lifetime earnings. If that 30% effect lasts for the rest of their life, that translates to an increase in lifetime earnings of about $100,000 in present value at age 8, discounting at roughly a 4% interest rate. So that it's worth about $100,000 in terms of total earnings gains at the point of the intervention when the kids are 8 years old. So quite a substantial impact from giving these families through a lottery a housing voucher subsidy that required them to move to a lower poverty area. Now, we want to weigh these gains against the costs of such a policy, right, in order to determine whether this policy makes sense. And so the second point to note in this context is that the gains in earnings actually end up ultimately saving the government a fair bit of money because they lead to substantial increases in tax revenue for the government itself. So if you look at the amount of taxes the kids in the three groups are paying when they're adults, you see that the children who were randomly assigned to the experimental voucher group are paying about twice as much in taxes to the US government relative to kids in the control group, which makes sense because they're earning significantly more. So some of that money is automatically getting returned to the government. And so an interesting consequence of that is that the housing vouchers actually end up saving the government money on net relative to keeping people in the public housing projects. So it turns out that if you look at the cost of people, giving people housing in the public housing projects versus giving them these subsidized housing vouchers, you might have thought that the subsidized housing vouchers are going to end up costing you more money, but that's actually not true because there's quite a significant cost of building the public housing projects to begin with. And so if you instead invest that money, put that money plus a little bit more towards these subsidized housing vouchers, you end up recovering the cost difference in the form of increased tax revenue down the road. So the thing basically pays for itself relative to keeping people in public housing. So a straightforward and actually quite important policy implication of that is that building housing projects where you concentrate poverty in certain areas is much worse for social mobility than a decentralized approach to affordable housing where you give people vouchers that they can use to buy houses or rent apartments in various places, which is going to naturally lead to more integration than the type of segregation that the public housing project model follows. And so that's a type of policy change that is something the US can shift more toward, and other countries, I think, are actually already trending in this direction of trying to take a more decentralized approach, and this suggests that that makes a lot of sense. Now, the third implication of this is that housing vouchers are much more effective when they are narrowly targeted. So first of all, you can see from the evidence I showed you that you need to target vouchers at families with young children in order to have a positive effect. So in the US at the moment, we have a policy that's particularly inefficient. because families get put on wait lists, often that last for many years, in order to get these housing vouchers. And so as a result, you end up becoming eligible to move only when your kids are older. And that's, in a sense, exactly the opposite of what you want to be doing, because you're really getting a gain only if you move the families with young kids. And so that's one sense in which I think the existing $25 billion expenditure in the US could be restructured in a much more effective way. A second implication, which is a little bit more subtle and I think more important in some ways, is that the vouchers seem most effective if they require families to move to better, that is, lower poverty areas. So you'll notice that in all of the results I showed you, the unrestricted Section 8 vouchers, that is the bars in the middle, were always producing smaller gains than the experimental voucher, even though the families could have made exactly the same choices that the families in the experimental voucher group had to make. That is, the people who moved to the middle of the Bronx could have chosen to move to the North Bronx with their voucher, but they did not make that choice. And as a result, their kids seem to have not done nearly as well as if they had moved to the North Bronx. Now, there's evidence from other work as well, which suggests that low-income families rarely use cash transfers. If you gave them $5,000 of cash, it doesn't seem to get spent in the form of trying to move to a better neighborhood, trying to get a better environment for your child, as measured by these objective criteria like the amount of integration in the area or the quality of the schools. And so why is that? That's actually kind of an interesting question in its own right. Why do families not seem to use this money in a way that would actually improve children's long-term outcomes? One potential explanation is that there might be behavioral biases at play where people are not fully informed about what the effects of living in these different neighborhoods might be, or they're worried about the costs of living in a very different type of area and so forth, and don't fully weight the gains that are going to accrue 15 years later to their kids from growing up in this better environment. Another possibility is essentially intergenerational externalities, that parents don't put adequate weight on their children's long-term outcomes in deciding where to live. Because remember, for the parents themselves, it doesn't seem to matter very much where you live in terms of your own earnings. In any case, it suggests that thinking about some of these issues where people might not be optimizing perfectly could be very important in designing these housing voucher policies. And you might actually have this implication that you want to tightly restrict the set of areas to which people can move using these vouchers in order to maximize the effects on social mobility, contrary to what you'd predict from the standard neoclassical economic model. Now, moving to thinking a bit more broadly now beyond these specific housing voucher policies, I think what this evidence suggests is that policies that increase integration could have significant impacts on social mobility, and these could take many forms, right? These could be things like tax credits to encourage building affordable properties in better neighborhoods, to basically incentivize developers to build in certain areas. At the broadest level, you can think about issues like the architecture of cities and urban planning, where usually people are not focused on issues of social mobility, but this type of evidence suggests that the way in which you design transit systems or zoning laws could have very important effects on the extent to which lower and higher income people of different backgrounds are in contact with each other, and that could have really important consequences for social mobility. Now, in thinking about all of those issues, I think there are a couple of important limitations in relying on the idea that you're just going to use housing policy to try to change social mobility. So let me talk about two of them. They basically both stem from the fact that equilibrium effects are likely to ultimately limit the gains from these types of housing policies. So what we've seen in the Moving to Opportunity experiment concretely is that moving people from Harlem to Bronx improves their own outcomes. But what we don't know is whether that move might have negative effects on the outcomes of those previously living in the Bronx, right? So when you're bringing in new people, we think maybe they're benefiting from being around these other folks who were doing better. But does that actually harm the people who were already there, who are now exposed to a different group of people who were not previously doing as well? That's not clear. And there are different models of interactions and peer effects that make different predictions about what would happen. So if you have a linear model of peer effects, so essentially something that would generate a zero-sum game, where if you are around people who are doing better, that helps you, but it hurts them in equal proportion, then you might not actually get any net gain from a social point of view in terms of moving people to these better areas. In contrast, you can have a very different model where bringing in people who are not doing as well doesn't actually hurt the more affluent people who are already in the new area if it's a model like if it's mentoring effects or role model effects that lead everyone to do better when they're exposed to new ideas in a new environment. So it's really ultimately an empirical question, which of these models is at play in terms of determining why integration seems to matter. Now, one fact that's useful to note is that empirically, in our data, we find that the more integrated neighborhoods, which we know are better for upward mobility, they're better for the low-income kids, if anything, they also have slightly better outcomes for the higher-income people living in those areas. So these areas that are more integrated, like San Francisco or Boston, relative to places like Atlanta or Charlotte, not only are the low-income people doing better there, but the higher-income people are also, if anything, doing somewhat better there. So it doesn't look like there's a one-for-one negative effect on the high-income people in places where the low-income people are doing well. That doesn't necessarily show you directly that integration is not harmful for higher-income individuals, because it's just a correlation. It doesn't directly show the causal effect of integration on higher-income individuals, but it's a suggestive piece of evidence that you may not have this zero-sum game property, in which case these policies wouldn't really make sense. The second limitation, which is somewhat more practical, is that there are basically limits to the scalability of policies that seek to move people, right? I mean, your policy solution at the end of the day can't just be that you're going to move everyone, because if you moved everyone in Harlem to the Bronx, it would be surprising if that had any effects, because you're essentially going to recreate Harlem in the Bronx, right? I mean, it's not like it's the soil in the place or some physical attribute of the place that's making people do well. It's presumably the set of people who live there. And so ultimately, I think you need to turn to policies that are going to improve a given neighborhood in order to improve social mobility, and you can't just rely on moving people around across areas. And so that's what I want to turn to next. And I'm going to focus in particular on education policies as one area where we can try to make some significant changes within a given neighborhood. So as you all know, improving school quality is a very widely discussed approach to improving children's outcomes across all countries. But one thing I want to stress is that as economists, naturally the first thing you think of when you think of a problem like this is maybe we should be spending more resources on schools in certain areas. But I don't think that's quite enough, or that's not an adequately precise solution to the problem, as Rick Hanushek, among others, has pointed out in a series of influential articles. And one way you can see that is that the US already spends more than most other developed countries on education, yet it has significantly worse outcomes in schools than most other developed countries. So if you just look at the raw correlations in the data, it doesn't seem totally obvious that higher expenditure, just throwing more dollars at the problem, is the silver bullet. So what I think one really needs to do is dig deeper and understand which educational inputs matter the most for children's long-term success. It could be various different factors. It could be the size of classrooms, could be the quality of teachers, could be the types of resources that we have in schools. Should we be giving each kid a laptop, for example? So there are many different dimensions in which you might spend that money to try to improve education. In recent work, each of these factors has been studied. People have looked at the long-term impacts of each of these things on children's long-term success. I'm going to focus here on teachers because I think there's particularly strong evidence that teachers have really substantial impacts. And I'll come back to talk a little bit about how teachers compare to some of the other inputs later on. So the study that I'm going to describe, where we look at teachers' impacts, is another example of using big data and quasi-experimental methods to analyze an issue that's relevant for policy. And in this case, the data we're using is school district records from the largest urban school district in the United States, where we get data on 2.5 million children who've written 18 million tests over the 20-year period that we study. And we link that data to the federal income tax returns that we've been using in all these other projects, where we're able to get information on these kids' earnings, where they went to college, whether they had a teenage birth, and various other outcomes. So essentially, the type of question you can ask when you connect these two data sets is, how does the quality of, say, your third grade teacher affect how much you're earning 25 years later when you're in the labor market? Okay? And by linking these data, you're able to track people without losing people over time, which is really critical. Now, in order to answer that question of how the quality of your teacher in third grade affects long-term outcomes, we need to first start by defining some measure of the quality of teachers. How am I going to classify one teacher as being high quality and another teacher as being lower quality? So one measure that's receiving a lot of attention in the current policy debate is what are called teacher value-added measures. So the idea here, there's some complicated statistics in the background, but the idea is really very simple. It's to ask how much a teacher raises his or her students' test scores on average. So for example, if I'm a fourth grade teacher, then my value added would be calculated as essentially the average test scores of my students at the end of fourth grade minus their average test scores at the end of third grade. So basically, how much progress did my students make on average? And if that looks really high, we'll say that I'm a high value added teacher. And if my students are not doing well relative to other students in the school, we're going to say I'm a low value added teacher. Now, these value added measures are very controversial in the policy debate, with some people arguing that this is a good way to evaluate teacher effectiveness and we should try to do more personnel evaluation to try to improve the quality of teaching using measures like this. And there are other people who say, you know, it's crazy to evaluate teachers on the basis of student standardized test performance, especially very young kids like in kindergarten or in third grade. And I think some of that initial skepticism comes from the very natural idea that maybe test scores at these very early ages, you know, kids write these standardized tests when they're in kindergarten or in third grade, do they possibly have any predictive content for things that we'd care about later on, like where they go to college or earnings or outcomes like that? So I think that's a very natural thing to be concerned about to begin with. So let me just show you some simple evidence which suggests that maybe these tests do actually have some information. So to make this concrete and show you what these tests are actually like, let's do an example, okay, of a kindergarten test. This is an actual question from a kindergarten test on the Stanford Achievement Test given to kids in the US. And here's how it works. As the teacher, I'll say a word to you, you listen for the ending sound, and then you circle the picture that starts with the same sound. Okay, so read those directions carefully, because when I've given this talk in the past, people have come up to me afterward and said, I really liked your talk, but I felt really bad because I got the kindergarten test question wrong. So the word here is cup, and so hopefully you know the answer is pencil and not duck. And the question we asked as researchers in this paper is, how did the kid who unfortunately said duck instead of pencil, how's he doing 20 years later when we see his earnings in the tax data? And here's your earnings versus your kindergarten test score. All right, so the x-axis here is your kindergarten test score percentile, and the y-axis is your average earnings between the ages of 25 and 27. So basic fact you see in the data, just to explain first of all how this is constructed. So we're taking data on thousands of kids. We're dividing the x-axis into 20 equal-sized bins. So each dot represents 5% of the data, and we're plotting average earnings within each of those bins. So what you can see is there's a really strong relationship between earnings and even your kindergarten test score. If you were at the bottom of your kindergarten class, you're making less than $10,000 a year. In your mid-20s, if you're at the top of your kindergarten class, average earnings are 2.5 times higher. Now, one thing that's very important in interpreting this graph is that this is not showing you that kindergarten test scores determine your entire life. That's not what it's saying. There's a lot of variance around these dots. There are lots of kids who have low test scores who end up doing well, and lots of kids who end up not doing so well in terms of earnings who have higher test scores. And that's reflected in the fact that the R squared of these test scores, the amount of variation they explain, is only something like 5 or 10%. So the point is not that the test scores perfectly predict later outcomes, it's that this conditional expectation, the idea is that there's some significant difference in average outcomes depending upon whether you have low or high test scores. So just as a starting point, I think this suggests that the test scores are not total noise. There is actually some content if you have a higher versus lower test score. So now, coming to the issue of teacher quality. So what we want to know is whether if you have a teacher who is high value added, who seems to be systematically raising students' test scores, that is a teacher who's basically pushing you towards the right side on this graph, does that help you in the long run? Does that have a causal effect on your earnings relative to having a teacher who's on the left side, who's relatively low value added, reducing test scores? So again, let's think about the ideal experiment that you'd want to run in order to answer that question. What you'd want to do is take a set of teachers and estimate their value added using prior data. So we've got a set of teachers, they've taught a set of kids in previous years. We estimate each of the teachers' value added based on their students' prior performance. And then we take a new set of children who come to kindergarten or in the next school year, and we tell their parents, look, we want to answer this really important question of whether teachers have long-term impacts. So we're going to conduct an experiment with your children where we're going to randomly assign them, some of them to high value-added teachers and some to low value-added teachers, and let's see how they do 20 years from now in terms of earnings, right? So that would be kind of the ideal experiment that you would run. Now, obviously, parents are typically not interested in participating in such an experiment, and so what I'll show you here is essentially a quasi-experimental approximation of exactly that idea. And what we're going to exploit is the fact that there's a lot of turnover in teachers within schools. There's a lot of variation in who happens to be teaching in a given school in a given grade, because teachers switch across schools, or they might go on maternity leave, things like that. And that creates essentially quasi-random variation in the quality of teachers a student has. So let me give you an example of how this works. So let's take a school where we're looking at students, let's say in 4th grade, and we're tracking the school over time. So every year represents a different set of kids who are arriving in 4th grade. So there are kids who get to 4th grade in 1993, then the next cohort of kids gets to 4th grade in 94, 95, and so on. So what happens in this school is at the beginning of the 1996 school year, a new teacher comes in and starts teaching in 4th grade, and that teacher is rated based on prior data in the top 5% of the value-added distribution. So it's rated to be a very high value-added teacher. So what we're going to do is essentially look at how test scores evolve in the school depending upon around the point where this high value-added teacher comes in. And the data that I'm going to show you here is drawing upon thousands of such events, averaging over thousands of such events in the data set that we have. And so what you can see is that before that teacher comes in, test scores are kind of bouncing around the median. And then as soon as this high value added teacher enters, test scores immediately jump up, and then they continue to stay high in subsequent years as that teacher continues to teach subsequent cohorts of children, which is exactly what you'd expect if you think that these high value added teachers are actually having a causal effect on their students' achievement on standardized tests, okay, which is the starting point of this analysis. So this shows you that within 4th grade, there appears to be a treatment effect when this high value added teacher comes in. But in any quasi-experiment, just like in any normal science experiment that you'd think about, you have a treatment group, which is what I've shown you here, but you also want to have a control group to make sure that nothing else changed at the same time that might be contaminating your analysis, right? So for example, here, you might be worried that something else changed in the school when this better teacher came in. Maybe the school suddenly got better resources or something else happened, which ended up improving student achievement due to another omitted factor. And so you want to have a control group to assess the importance of such effects. And in this context, there's a very natural control group, which is to think about test scores in the previous grade, in this example in 3rd grade. And the idea is that the better teacher came in 4th grade, she should not have had any effect on 3rd grade achievement, because nothing changed in 3rd grade in terms of teachers at the same time. And so in fact, if you plot 3rd grade test scores, you see that as you'd expect, they're totally flat around the point of entry of that high value added teacher. So you're seeing the effect exactly where you'd expect it in the treatment group, but not in the control group. So this type of evidence really makes us think that these high value added teachers have significant causal effects on student achievement. Now this also works, by the way, in the opposite direction, where if you have this teacher who unfortunately doesn't want to be there and is in the bottom 5% of the value added distribution, that teacher pulls down test scores as soon as he shows up relative to the prior grade. Okay, so it's totally symmetric across the distribution. So far that just shows you that these high versus low value added teachers, they have an effect on student achievement on test scores. But now coming back to the issue of mobility and long-term outcomes, what's in some ways more important is that if you by chance end up getting a high value added teacher rather than a low value added teacher when you were in 3rd grade, you see these persistent, long-lasting effects on children's outcomes. So this chart here plots your probability of attending college versus your teacher value added in 3rd grade in 1 year in elementary school. And you can see that if you happen to have a low value added teacher for a single year, say in the bottom 5% down here, as opposed to a teacher with value added in the top 5%, it affects your probability of going to college by about 2 percentage points. Now, in thinking about the magnitude of that effect, remember that that's the effect of a single teacher for 1 year, right? So if you think that these effects cumulate, that you have a better teacher not just in 3rd grade, but also in 4th grade and 5th grade and in 6th grade, then that 2 percentage point effect per year could add up to quite substantial changes in the probability that you go to college. Similarly, you see that if you happen to get a high value added teacher, you're earning significantly more as an adult than if you have a low value added teacher. And I'll come back to talk about the magnitude of this effect in a second. And then taking another outcome, the fraction of women with teenage births, you're less likely to have a teenage birth if you happen to have a high value added teacher when you're in elementary school than if you have a low value added teacher. So on a number of dimensions, it looks like teacher quality has these significant long-term impacts. Now, what are the magnitudes of these effects? Thinking now to policy analysis and how large these effects actually are. Let's think about the following feasible policy exercise which people are currently thinking about conducting in the US. So what I want to do here is take the bell curve of teacher quality, and suppose I take the teachers who are in the bottom 5% of the distribution and replace them with teachers of average quality, which is in principle a feasible policy change that I should be able to implement. The estimates that I've just shown you imply that that will increase the lifetime earnings of a given child, undiscounted, by $50,000 over the course of their life on average. And that adds up to roughly $1.4 million per classroom of 28 students, which is the average size of US classrooms, which is worth, if you think about it from an investment perspective, about $250,000 in present value around age 10 or 11 if you're discounting at a 5% interest rate. So quite a substantial impact in terms of improving quality just from the bottom 5% to the average, not even getting to the issue of trying to get top-notch superstar teachers. So there are potentially quite large effects here in terms of changing children's long-term outcomes. And so the broader message of this is that improving the quality of elementary education, I think, can be a key policy tool to increasing upward mobility. And teacher quality appears to be particularly important, perhaps more so based on other evidence than reductions in class size. So the consequence of that, I think, is that it's critical to attract and retain top talent in teaching. And one way to think about how one might want to do that is kind of like a superstar model of a profession where you reward and retain the most talented teachers rather than the current system in the US where there's very little ability to keep a selected set of teachers on the staff. That could require higher salaries. Ultimately, my sense is it'll also require some changes in professional status. So countries that have the best educational systems which seem to have the best teachers are places like Finland, where teaching is perceived as a profession that's one of the highest in terms of the status hierarchy, where children who are doing very well in school have the aspiration of becoming teachers, which is certainly very different from the situation in the US. I think also programs such as Teach First in the UK or Teach for America in the US are very successful in attracting talented kids into teaching, but they would be much more effective if they actually got teachers to stay in teaching. The challenge these programs face is that most of the people who enter them stay for a couple of years and then end up going to other jobs. And so retention turns out to be a key issue. So one of the nice things in the context of education policy is that ultimately this type of work ends up having some impact on policy. And so just to illustrate that, the implications of this type of research for the students here, let me show you a little bit of what's happened in the US over the past couple of years. So at the national level here, you see the president in the State of the Union address saying that we know a good teacher can increase the lifetime income of a classroom by over $250,000. And so the White House then initiated a program to increase teacher evaluation around school districts in the country. And then a number of local school districts, like here you see Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, talking about how effective teachers make kids less likely to become pregnant, more likely to go to college, and so on. The city of New York has tried to change teacher evaluation and retention policies in various ways. Probably the most important impact of this type of work is in the context of litigation, where there's an important lawsuit called Vergara versus California, which challenges some of the ways in which teacher hiring and retention policies are made in California school districts, where essentially there's no scope for performance evaluation, so you don't have the ability to keep the best teachers. So you hear examples of very highly qualified teachers who were rated among the best in the school system also being laid off at the same time, because the law requires that you always have to lay off the youngest teacher, the teacher who was hired most recently. And you can't use the quality of the teacher in determining who to lay off. So on the basis of this type of evidence, there's a lawsuit which ultimately was decided in favor of the plaintiff, arguing that teacher quality is really important. We should change these laws to try to reduce the amount of inequity in education and ultimately improve social mobility and so on. Okay, so the last set of issues that I'll discuss more briefly are the implications of equality of opportunity for economic growth. So until now, we've basically taken for granted that our objective should be to increase social mobility, whether through housing voucher policies or education policies, et cetera. But it's not clear that all policies that increase mobility are desirable. So for example, one way to increase social mobility, to actually in some ways achieve perfect social mobility, in the context of education, would be to randomly assign seats at college. So for example, suppose we did college admissions at Cambridge just by randomly admitting people without paying attention to their qualifications. That would actually maximize social mobility, literally measured, because you would end up having an equal chance of getting into an elite institution regardless of your parent background. But I think most of us would think that that's not really a sensible policy, even though it maximizes social mobility, because it violates other things that we care a lot about. For instance, meritocracy, giving people with greater merit better opportunities. And from an economic point of view, it would also very likely reduce total economic output and growth. So it's not totally clear that increasing social mobility is always a good thing. And I think really the key question is whether increasing opportunities for low-income children ultimately ends up harming higher-income children or affecting total economic output in some adverse way. Now, notice that if you're thinking about measuring mobility in terms of relative ranks in the income distribution, it has to be true mechanically that if someone is ranked higher, somebody else has to be ranked lower. So if we're going to use a rank-based measure of mobility, it's mathematically a fact that if you have higher upward mobility, you have to have greater downward mobility as well. However, that's not necessarily true in absolute dollars, right? If we're measuring everyone's income in absolute dollars, then if kids from low-income backgrounds earn more, that doesn't necessarily mean that kids from higher income backgrounds have to earn less. Now, the mobility measures that we used in the work that I was talking about mainly in the last lecture, they use national ranks. So they're effectively absolute measures from the perspective of a small local area. So essentially, you can think about these national ranks as equivalent to asking whether children reach a given dollar income threshold. Because within the city of Boston, if I'm doing better in national terms, that's not going to affect anybody else within my small area necessarily. And so it's essentially like asking, what's the probability of crossing some fixed dollar threshold? And so one thing you can do with the data that we were looking at previously is basically ask whether areas with higher upward mobility for low-income children also do they have worse outcomes for high-income children, or do the high-income children not seem to be affected? And you'll remember this was one of the early charts that I started out with in the last lecture, showing what intergenerational mobility looks like in Salt Lake City, which has relatively good outcomes for children from low-income families, versus Charlotte, which has relatively poor outcomes. And what you see that's important in this chart is that for the high-income kids, if you were kind of in the example I was giving about college, where you have a fixed number of seats, and you make it easier for the low-income kids to do well, that's going to harm the high-income kids' chances of getting in and hurt them. If that were the model, you would expect to see that in Salt Lake City, the children from the higher income backgrounds would do worse than the kids from the lower income backgrounds. But that's in fact not what you see, right? It's actually not true that the children from higher income families in Salt Lake City are doing any worse. That is, you're getting more upward mobility in absolute terms for kids from low income families without harming the kids from high income families, at least in the context of this particular example. And it turns out to be true more generally that in most of the cases we look at, kind of 85% of the cases, you end up finding a situation where increases in upward mobility for low-income families don't actually end up affecting adversely outcomes for kids from higher income families. So it doesn't seem like there's a hard trade-off between the two things, at least when you look at this geographical variation. Now, one final set of results that speaks to this issue a little bit more directly and concretely is this final study that I'm going to talk about, which focuses on innovation as a pathway to upward mobility. So innovation is basically an example that illustrates how social mobility can actually end up increasing the total size of the economic pie and be beneficial even for kids from more affluent backgrounds who wouldn't directly benefit themselves from efforts to improve opportunities for social mobility. So the logic here is very simple. New inventions can increase total output. If you've got another kid who ends up discovering inventing something like the iPhone, that might be good for everyone, not just the earnings of the inventor himself. So I'm going to show you how innovation relates to issues of social mobility and equality of opportunity. In order to do that, I'm going to measure innovation in a specific way by using data on patenting. And we're going to study the lives of 750,000 patent holders in the US by using the universe of patent records and linking that again to the tax data. So let me start with this chart here, which shows you patent rates versus your parents' income. So on the x-axis is your parents' income percentile from 1 to 100, and the y-axis is the number of kids who become inventors per 10,000. And you can see that there's an incredibly strong relationship between the probability you become an inventor and your parents' income. So in particular, if you're born to a family below the median in terms of income, about 2.2 out of 10,000 of those kids end up having a patent. And that compares with a patent rate for children who happen to be born to parents in the top 1%, that's 10 times higher. So there's this tenfold gap in rates of invention between kids born to very high income families versus median income families. So why is that? That could be for various reasons. It could be potentially because of differences in environment, which are a set of issues I've been talking about in these lectures. It could also be because of differences in ability and differences in genetics, right? Surely there's some genetic transmission such that parents who are higher income are higher ability, they have higher ability kids, and maybe those kids are just more likely to have to invent something because in a sense they're smarter and they have better genetic ability. So one can evaluate that possibility and discriminate between the environmental explanation versus the genetic explanation in the following way: by using test score data measured early on as a proxy for ability. Okay, so now I'm going to bring in the test score data that I used in the education study. And this chart here plots the number of inventors, the same y-axis as the previous graph, versus third grade math test scores. And there are 20 dots here, so each dot represents 5% of the distribution. And what you can see, first of all, in these data is that third grade test scores predict the probability you're going to become an inventor fairly well. So basically, if you're below the 85th percentile of your third grade math class, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to invent anything. Okay? And then if you're above the 85th percentile, there's a really sharp increase in the probability that you become an inventor, and the kids who are really at the top of their third grade math class are much more likely to have an invention when they're adults. Now, what's interesting about this, connecting back to the issues of equality of opportunity, is the following chart. So now let's break down that analysis, splitting the data into kids who have parents who are below the median, shown in the blue here, so from relatively low-income families, and kids who are from relatively rich families above the median in terms of income. And what you can see is that below the 90th percentile, there are 10 dots here, each dot represents 10% of the test score distribution. Below the 90th percentile, those two track each other fairly closely. But when you take the smartest kids in their third grade class, the kids who are in the top 10% of the distribution, if you happen to be really smart, doing really well in third grade, and you're from a high-income family, you're much more likely to become an inventor. But if you're very smart and you're from a low-income family, you're not actually all that much more likely to become an inventor. So even conditioning on this measure of ability, your third grade test scores, you see these quite substantial differences in probability of becoming an inventor, which looks more like it's potentially consistent with something about environment rather than purely differences in ability across these two groups. Now, it turns out that these gaps in test scores grow rapidly as children get older. By 8th grade, 50% of this innovation gap can be explained by differences in test scores. So basically, the low-income kids are falling further and further behind the high-income kids and ultimately end up becoming much less likely to become inventors, very consistent with the idea that it's childhood environment that really seems to matter here. And that implies that there's significant lost talent, basically, that potentially is reducing aggregate economic output and aggregate social welfare. So this is a very different perspective on the problem, right? It's not just about issues of justice and equality of opportunity. Potentially, by not having these kids from lower income backgrounds have the same opportunities, you're reducing the total size of the economic pie. And I just want to mention as an aside, a little bit tangential to my main focus here, that this misallocation of talent is not necessarily just along income dimensions. There are many other dimensions along which it might be relevant as well. So as another example we look at in this study, we look at the gender gap in innovation, so the fraction of inventors who are female, and we look at that over time by birth cohort. So in 1940, something like 4 or 5% among people born in 1940, something like 4 or 5% of inventors were women, patent holders were women. That has gone up over time. It's steadily increased, but it's only at about 14% today. And so at the rate of increase that we've seen of about 0.25 percentage points per year, that implies that it's going to take another 140 years to get to a point where you have a 50-50 share. Now, again, that's a potential dimension where you have significant misallocation of talent, where there are lots of people who could be, lots of women who would potentially be having significant innovations that for some reason are not being drawn into this sector. And that's a different set of issues, I think, to consider. So the key lesson of this analysis, just to wrap up, is that improving equality of opportunity could ultimately benefit the aggregate economy, could potentially be beneficial even for those who are already affluent. But I want to emphasize, not overstate the evidence here. Innovation is only one pathway to upward mobility, right? So all I'm saying is that there are some pathways to upward mobility that might not have this zero-sum game type of property that might end up benefiting everyone. We need to do further work to figure out, on average, whether greater social mobility for the poor ends up being beneficial or not for higher income individuals. So let me conclude by just talking about some of the broadest lessons that I draw from this body of work. So one of the simplest messages that I hope comes out of what I've talked about in these last two lectures is that we should try to tackle social mobility at primarily a local level and not just the national level. So people talk a lot about why is social mobility low in the US or in the UK, but these data suggest that that's not actually the right way to think about it. You really want to think about particular neighborhoods and why it's low in certain areas. Second, the childhood environment really seems to be critical at all ages, not just the very earliest ages. And there are a couple of policies which I've talked about in this lecture today that potentially might improve childhood environment, including housing voucher subsidies that are well targeted or improving the quality of primary education. But I want to stress that those are only two examples of the types of policies that we should be thinking about to improve childhood environment. And so really, I think the broadest lesson, the more important lesson here in some ways, is that it's extremely important to evaluate other policies scientifically using the types of tools I've been talking about here to measure local progress and performance. I think one of the major issues in terms of government policy is that we tend to spend a lot more money on things like housing vouchers, education, and so on, relative to how much we know about the effectiveness of these policies. So our expenditure on trying to combat poverty and increase social mobility greatly outweighs our expenditure on trying to actually figure out which of these policies works. And that doesn't seem like a great use of money. So one tool to facilitate such analysis, to try to make it feasible to evaluate these policies more easily, one thing we're doing in the US, using the data we've constructed, is to publicly disseminate mobility statistics by county, by year, in order to measure the impacts of new interventions in the US. So for some of the students here or others, you might be interested in these data. You can actually download all of the data that I've been showing you, the geographic data, which give you these county-level measures of mobility over time from this website, equalityofopportunity.org, which gives you lots of information on social mobility by area, which ultimately the vision is other researchers might be able to study various other policies without having to go back to the raw tax data, and they'll be able to evaluate the impacts of various interventions on social mobility. So let me conclude by going back to the statistics that I started out with at the very beginning of the first lecture. Rates of upward mobility across areas in the US and in the United Kingdom. And when you look at these data, I think you can have one of two perspectives. One perspective you might have when you look at the US on average or the UK, countries that don't actually have very high rates of upward mobility, you can have kind of a pessimistic point of view that it doesn't look like social mobility is all that high. We live in a society that's quite stratified by social class. But I actually look at this from a more positive point of view as presenting an opportunity and a challenge. So the opportunity that one sees here is that there are places even within the United States, quite nearby typically, relative to where people are currently living, which offer much greater prospects of social mobility. Places like San Jose or a smaller city in Iowa called Dubuque, where a remarkable 18% of kids who start out in the bottom 20% end up in the top 20% of the income distribution. So the fact that there's so much variation, even within a relatively similar set of areas, suggests that there's quite a bit of opportunity to increase social mobility. I think the challenge that this creates is for researchers to figure out what types of policies will be most effective in increasing social mobility. And for practitioners, some of you who will go in to work on policy issues, I think the important challenge is to figure out how to implement some of the solutions that come out of this research. Thank you.